Hello everybody, and before we get on to the main part of Drydock episode 36, there are a few things which you can comment on in the comment section that might change a few bits and pieces about how the channel is run. So first of all, upload time. I usually upload videos at 10 o'clock UK time, basically because that seems very convenient for the UK and people based in Europe. But I have noticed people have been saying, "Oh, they're waking up at or still awake at 4 or 5 in the morning." Presumably that's on in America, Canada, that sort of area. Um, so would people like me to change my upload time, perhaps to maybe 12 noon UK time or something like that? So that's first thing you can vote on. Second thing, unexpectedly, the sort of vintage lounge music I chose for the April Fool's video seems to have had something of a positive reception. So I'm considering possibly switching to using that music for the intro for the Wednesday specials. So that would we'd still keep the existing intro music for the Drydock, and I'm sorry, the Drydock's got someone already, for the 5 minute guides. So, but then that would mean that each type of video, the Wednesday specials, the 5 minute guides, and the Drydock each have their own distinct music. So, again, if you want me to use the music from the April Fool's video intro as the Wednesday special intro, let me know in the comment below. Next thing, some people have asked. Yes, I will be at Tankfest this year. That's down in Bovington in Dorset in the UK. So if anybody else is going and they want to come and find me, well, you can come and find me. Good luck. Then what else have we got here? Oh yes, references to other videos. There've been a few comments saying, well, I'm referencing other videos I've done in new videos. Could we get a link to it? So yes, I can do that if people want. Just a quick comment on how you'd prefer me to do that. Whether should I put a link in the video description, or should I try and figure out the YouTube link card system so it happens during the video itself at the appropriate moment? And finally, in terms of the sources that I'm using, obviously we'll still be listing those, but I have also been offered a little Amazon store place, so link for that in the description if you happen to want to pick up any naval reference books, either ones that I've mentioned in the videos recently or ones that you might be interested in generally, or you're just looking for naval book recommendations. Well, I'll say link in the description. I'll be expanding that book range over the next few weeks. But yeah, if you want to go and have a click, have a browse, feel free to do so. No obligation, obviously. It's just something I thought people might like. So, with all of that out of the way, let's get on to this episode of the Drydock properly. And obviously, it is first Drydock of the month, which means Patreon Q&A will dominate most of it. But we will start off with the videos from the week after last week's reviews. So the two videos that we're going to be answering questions on more directly this week are the Battle of Samar alternate history video and the Russian circular warships video. That was about a month ago. So Battle of Samar alternate history, obviously sources the same as the week before's video on the actual Battle of Samar, with additional thanks to my wargaming group for helping me wargame the results such as they were. And with that, let's go on to the questions that are from that particular video. So first of the selected questions, Josh Thomas Moore asks, what would have happened if the Cumberland had taken part in the Battle of the River Plate? As if I'm not mistaken, she was meant to be part of that force but was refitting. I imagine that Exeter would be quite happy to have another cruiser to help her, if only because she's not going to be the only one being shot at quite so much. So yes, the Cumberland was a county class cruiser, heavy cruiser with 4 twin turrets with 8-inch guns, as opposed to Exeter, which had 3 twin turrets. It's a slightly smaller, diminutive version of the heavy cruiser. So if Cumberland had been there along with Exeter, Ajax or Ajax, and Achilles, then it's relatively possible that Graf Spee may not have actually made it to Montevideo. as we know from history, from the actual battle, Exeter's 8-inch shells were capable of hurting the Graf Spee and did most of the significant damage. And, well, Cumberland has a couple of extra guns compared to Exeter, and overall increases the number of 8-inch guns present by over 100%. And as you say, it's also another target to shoot at, and it's bigger, better protected, and more likely to draw Graf Spee's attention, which obviously is then going to allow the other ships to get more accurate fire in. So yeah, with all four going at the Graf Spee, it's highly likely, I would say, that Graf Spee is probably not going to make it to Montevideo, or else is going to be forced to break and run for Montevideo very early, as opposed to sort of sitting around and trying to slug it out with the various ships. It's obviously, that's not to say that a county class on its own can fight a Deutschland, but a county class would be, well, it would be the heaviest British combatant there, and considerably adds to the firepower of the overall squadron. And although Graf Spee was designed to fight cruisers, and although it obviously gave a relatively good account for itself against a small heavy cruiser and two light cruisers, when you're talking about the Exeter and the two Leanders, you're talking about sort of the lower end of the light and heavy cruiser spectrums, whereas Cumberland represents the higher end of the heavy cruiser spectrum. So, yeah, I don't see that ending well for the Graf Spee. A cat with a top hat asks, during the scenario for the alternate history Battle of Samar, were aircraft based on the temporary bases on the island ever considered, since it seems it would be a major advantage for the US to call in the various torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters to conduct strikes on the Japanese? So, for the sake of simplicity, we try to make it as much a direct swap as possible, i.e., effectively teleporting the 7th Fleet in and Taffy 3 out, swapping their respective locations a few hours before the Japanese Center Force shows up, at which point all of these kind of extra scenarios where possibly external support could have been called in, or Taffy 1 and 2 could have got aircraft in the air earlier, didn't happen historically, so we didn't see any particular reason to try and make them happen this time. Otherwise, the variables just get too wild, and the end result would be, well, the end result's always speculation, but it would be far more wild speculation than I'd be comfortable with trying. Rory Mackenzie asks, was swarming the enemy with Fletchers an actual US tactic? If the Americans lost their battleships and then the Yamato was swarmed by Fletchers and still sunk, how would that affect naval doctrine? Well, in terms of naval doctrine, everyone was very well aware that a battleship could be swarmed by destroyers armed with torpedoes, so I don't think it would have been a massive shake-up of naval doctrine, other than perhaps just re-emphasizing that yes, you do actually need to escort your capital ships and not let them get drawn away. In terms of swarming the enemy with Fletchers, given the battle practices and historical record, if the US had the opportunity to do so, it definitely would have been something they would have tried. But at the same time, there are relatively few ground surface actions in the Pacific theatre, and it's less of a case of whether or not they would have or could have done so. It's more of a matter of, did they have the opportunity? And in this particular case, the scenario as presented, they had the opportunity, whereas in most other cases they didn't. Perhaps the closest, ironically, would have actually been the Battle of Surigao Strait immediately before the Battle of Samar, and in that you can actually see that basically every US destroyer in the vicinity tried to get some action in, shooting up the Japanese southern force. So yeah, I think it's fairly plausible that in a real life scenario where the opportunity presented itself, a mass attack by destroyers definitely would have been an American tactic. Tuning 3434 says, why do you consider US cruisers to be much more effective against Imperial Japanese cruisers in this scenario compared to the relatively one-sided battles during the Indonesia campaigns and ABDA command? Part of it, as you intimated in the rest of your question, is that by this point the Long Lance's extraordinary range was much more of a known factor than it was early in the war. but also the fact that in the early campaigns, the Imperial Japanese Navy obviously was a bit more prepared for war going into war, since they're the ones who started it all. And so their battle doctrine was arguably a little bit more advanced, and they also had the advantage when it came to things like night fighting and such, because again they trained for it. By the time you get to this kind of scenario, in the latter part of World War II, the American cruisers' battle doctrine has evolved considerably. Their crews are a lot more experienced. They also, and most critically, they also now, on the American side, have radar and very good fire control systems, which negate a lot of the Japanese advantages when it came to night fighting, because of course radar can see a lot further than the human eye can, and can see through smoke and all other sorts of weather conditions as well. And couple that with an excellent fire control system, and all of a sudden the gunfire advantage has switched entirely in the Americans' favour. Lloyd Knighton asks, if Bismarck and Prince Eugen had escaped from the Royal Navy and attacked convoys off the US coastline, did the US Navy have any modern battleship afloat at the time which could have dealt with Bismarck? Well, presumably you're talking about a 1v1, at which point, yes, kind of. I mean, obviously the standards of various flavours, 14 and 16 inch, were around, albeit they are far too slow to actually force an engagement that the Bismarck doesn't want. Interestingly enough, in terms of modern battleships, the US Navy is literally just in the process of commissioning North Carolina and Washington, and they are actually both on the East Coast, which is vaguely useful. Their firepower is certainly capable of dealing with Bismarck. However, at this particular point, they've literally only just come into commission and are still going through acceptance trials. So this is probably the worst possible time for either North Carolina or Washington to try and engage Bismarck, as they still haven't solved the engine and propeller issues. So their speed is, well, it's greater than the standards, but it's far off from their 28 knot design speed at this point. And they had problems ever getting up to that kind of speed. They've also got their very earliest fire control and radar fit outs. And of all the US modern battleships, the North Carolinas are the least protected. So yes, in theory, North Carolina or Washington could have sailed up and fought Bismarck and had a reasonably decent chance, but I'd be much more leery of their chances at that point, having just been commissioned, than I would at maybe a year or two down the line. And lastly, for this particular video, in this particular episode, GRV01 asks, I've read about developments by the US Navy late in the Iowa's service lives to extend the range of the main guns. Do you have any more information on these projects? Well, this is necessarily a relatively quick summation, but yes, the Iowas did receive or have experimented with a number of rather interesting shell types after World War II. This included what was effectively a 16-inch cluster bomb full of lots of anti-personnel mines, or grenades, depending on which source you read, which would obviously be fairly effective against soft targets, perhaps more effective against human targets than even the high explosive shell. There was also an improved high explosive shell that could get ranges of over 50,000 yards, with a fairly high muzzle velocity, but that particular shell didn't seem to get into service because they were still developing it right up when the Iowas were decommissioned for the final time after the Gulf War. And there were actually two subcaliber Sabo shell designs, and both of which carried submunitions, much like the giant cluster bomb shell that I mentioned earlier. One of these being a sort of a roughly 13.5-inch diameter, and the other one being the 11-inch one that you referenced in your question. And again, both of these were designed to have very much extended ranges over the most capable normal shells, with quoted ranges of between 70 and 100,000 yards, depending on the source and depending on which particular subcaliber shell you're looking at. So these were very much short bombardment shells. They were not designed for use against other warships. And that brings us on to the other video, the Russian circular warships video. And there's only really one primary source for this one, and that is the Circular Ironclad's article in Warship 2015 by Stephen McLaughlin, which contains a very, very comprehensive write-up of the whole thing. There are obviously a bunch of other smaller references made in various other sources, but those are sort of incidental mentions confirming details like armament and such. Because to be honest, not a vast amount has been written about these ships in credible naval history books. They are mentioned in the so-called World's Worst Warships by Anthony Preston, but I don't tend to rate that book very highly, if at all. So yeah, that's one primary source, and yeah, lots of incidental mentions in other sources that cover that period. Gottjäger asks, could a second Vanguard have been built using the turrets from the various monitors, and would this have an effect on the service of the class, potentially longer service deployments to Suez, Korea, Malaysia, etc.? I mean, yes, in theory. Obviously, having the turrets around means that the same rationale that went behind Vanguard of being able to build a battleship quickly because you already had the guns and turrets technically still applies if you pull the turrets off of those ships as well. However, one is that there weren't that many spare 15-inch turrets left, and so that might have been a bit of a close run thing, since the various monitors obviously only had the one turret apiece, but also, whilst technically possible, it would run into the larger issues of building an entire second battleship. If they had done so, if we just ignore the logistical issues behind it, but if we say, right, well, they pulled all the turrets off the monitors, we're going to build another Vanguard. Effect on service, they might have, depending on, they might have actually pulled one or more of the King George V's out of service, or basically just immediately at the end of World War II scrapped everything but the Vanguards at this point, and the King George V's. The King George V's might well have then gone out of service from reserve sooner. Whether or not they would have had longer service, I don't think they'd have much longer service. Potentially, one of them might have gone into reserve, or as with HMS Eagle and HMS Ark Royal later on down the line, maybe one might have been cannibalized for spare parts to keep the other one running. But yeah, I don't think they would have lasted that much longer without a significant change in Royal Navy doctrine, or other availability of other ships. Stephen Mikalski asks, please clarify, constructed on the Baltic for use in the Black Sea or for the Baltic? This is obviously for the Russian circular warships. So yes, this was due to a slight screw-up of mine. Even though I had written the appropriate seas, I just somehow ended up saying Baltic a lot when I should have said Black. So yes, the Novgorod built on the Baltic Sea, deconstructed and taken across for service on the Black Sea. The Popov was then built and used on the Black Sea. So yes, many apologies for that particular little word whisker there. I shall try to avoid that in the future. USS Grey Ghost asks, what ships do you think were actually unequal to the USS Olympia? Well, as we covered in the video on the Olympia, it was really a very overbuilt ship. I mean, it's effectively, in a lot of ways, it's kind of like an armoured cruiser in a protected cruiser's clothing, but it is ultimately still a protected cruiser. So if you were going to say, well, what ships were equal to USS Olympia from around that time, my default answer would probably be to look at some of the armoured cruisers, but that's kind of cheating. That's kind of like asking, well, what ship could match, I don't know, a Cleveland in World War II, and then saying, well, if we want to go and look at Des Moines or something like that, well, yeah, again, a little bit of a cheat. So in terms of just protected cruisers, it's quite difficult to say. Olympia is pretty much top of the tier for protected cruisers. About the closest I could come up with would have been maybe the Mersey class protected cruisers of the Royal Navy, which carried a similar degree of armament, not quite as heavily armed, but close, and almost as heavily armoured. But even then, they're not really going to match up to the Olympia truly. There were certainly a number of protected cruisers that carried a heavier main battery, 10-inch, 11-inch, and even 12-inch guns, believe it or not. But I wouldn't rate them as capable as the Olympia, both because they tended to carry either one or two of those big guns, as opposed to the four 8-inch guns that Olympia carried, and also the fact that though when you're getting up to that kind of almost battleship level firepower, your rate of fire is quite slow. So Olympia's 8-inch guns have a significant rate of fire advantage aside from their uh, greater numbers. Zombie Hero 14 asks, were replacement barrels for naval guns typically manufactured all at once or only when needed? Generally, navies would try and order many guns at the same time, both for obviously economy of scale and to have any on hand in case something went wrong. So generally, the replacement barrels were manufactured around the same time as the main guns, the first set of barrels that went on the main guns of the ship in question. Occasionally, they did do second production runs if the gun had an unusually long lifespan and it was beginning to look like they might run out of spare barrels, but that was generally not so much the case. I mean, you can look at, for example, a good example of this is actually the 16-inch 50 caliber gun, not the Iowa's one, but the one that was designed for use on the Lexingtons and South Dakotas of the 1920s. If you look at the number of ships that had been ordered and were under construction at the time versus the number of guns manufactured, you'll see there's actually quite a lot more guns manufactured there. And once obviously they went off into storage, they stayed there and then they were distributed across all sorts of places. But you can see that from the sheer number of guns that the US Navy had ordered, even though they hadn't even got through the full production run of Lexingtons and South Dakotas at that point. Kylar Stern asks, considering the theory of the fleet in being and the ideas behind commerce warfare, in particular the fact your enemy needs multiple times your force to protect all his convoys, do you think it is the superior form of naval warfare as compared to trying to fight a decisive engagement? Well, for a smaller nation, certainly, it's pretty much the only thing you can do, and it allows you to a certain extent to neutralize portions of the enemy's fleet that might otherwise do more direct damage to you. But overall, it is still not the ideal form of warfare because by dint of the fact you're having to adopt it, it means that your nation and your industry is going to be smaller. You're going to be economically weaker than the target you're trying to fight, which means that you have to calculate exactly how you're going to go to war very precisely and hope that your enemy cooperates, which is never really guaranteed. Because ultimately, if you have your fleet in being, and yes, you're tying down large numbers of enemy forces, but the implication, therefore, of having that larger enemy in the first place is that there is every chance that they will simply just build more and more and more and more ships until they can force a decisive engagement or just knock you out wherever it is you're hiding, regardless of your relative strength at the time. And you can see this in World War II. After Jutland, the Kaiser realized that if they tried to fight a decisive engagement, he would lose, so he kept the High Seas Fleet at home, and so the effect of the High Seas Fleet's existence on the Royal Navy, though it was still considerable, lessened significantly after Jutland because they just didn't come out very often, which allowed the Royal Navy to devote resources to other areas. And then in the Second World War, you can see both the Japanese and the German forces. Initially, their smaller fleets were able to tie down a lot of resources of the Royal and US Navies, respectively, but after 2 or 3 years, once the industrial advantages of those two nations came into play, they just started taking apart the German and Japanese navies all over the place. So, like Tirpitz, yeah, it tied down tons and tons of resources right up until Britain just went, okay, have some tall boys, as well as some midget submarines just before that, and that was the end of that. The short summary version will basically be, if you're going to have a fleet in being, then you need to use it to buy you time, and you need to get your objectives done very quickly in that time, and better hope you haven't ticked off the bigger nation to such a point that they're not going to let you sit there with your objectives and they're going to do everything they possibly can to take it back. Because if they do, you don't really have a chance at that point. Oh, this flipping phone. Right, and with that, it's on to the Patreon questions, so buckle in, there's quite a few of them. Mark Morgan asks, will there be a follow-up to The Voyage of the Damned about the Battle of Tsushima? Yes, there most certainly will be. Hopefully in the next couple of months. I know there's been quite a few sort of part twos that have been left hanging by various Wednesday special videos. So, yeah, hopefully we will be seeing that relatively soon. Raven KKABC777 asks, thanks for answering my question about the Chinese Empire that we're doing in the previous one of the previous Drydocks. I still wonder which country the Chinese Empire would buy their ships from. Given their previous history, most likely Germany. The Japanese at the time were buying ships from France and then from Britain, and the Chinese, being the Japanese's enemy, are unlikely to want to buy ships from the same source, although that had never stopped people in the past, in that period. See the naval arms race in the South America, where everyone was just buying ships from Britain as well as other countries. But no, seriously, the Chinese had a history of buying ships from Germany at the time. The American Navy, at the kind of time period that we were talking about with your previous question about the Chinese potentially getting their act together, the US Navy was still relatively small. It was about to grow quite massively, but its industrial shipyard capacity was not as big as it would be in the 20th century. I mean, fair enough, Germany's pretty much going through the same thing, but they started a little bit earlier. So I think the majority of Chinese shipping at this period would probably be coming from Germany, with maybe some attempts to self-build, similar to what the Japanese would try. Arm Raider asks, how do you feel the Battle of the Hampton Roads, its aftermath and the Union response would have gone if Monitor had sunk on one of the two times it almost did on the way to Hampton Roads and had therefore been unavailable to interrupt Virginia's rampage? So, assuming that Monitor did sink on its way to Hampton Roads, obviously Virginia is going to continue to lay into the Union shipping there and probably going to break the blockade or force the Union Navy at least to withdraw to a much more distant blockade, which will involve them committing more ships and more resources. So that would be a big black mark against the Union Navy and the Union in general, and has the potential to prolong the war because if they're having to build replacements rather than holding the fort with the Monitor as they did historically until they could get more in service, that allows the Confederate Navy and merchant shipping getting to and from the Confederacy a lot more freedom of operation, at least until the Union leverages its industrial capacity to bring the hammer down in a big way, as they did historically. Now, as far as the Union response, well, bear in mind, as we mentioned in the video on the Monitor, that the Union was also building Galena and New Ironsides at pretty much the same time, albeit they would take longer to construct than another Monitor. It's entirely possible, to be honest, that this one incident might actually see the Union Navy put in much better stead in terms of maintaining its frontline combat strength in the future after the American Civil War concludes, because if the Monitor had sunk in a storm and the cause was directly attributed to the fact it had such a low freeboard, that could discredit the idea of an ocean-going Monitor almost entirely at the time, because given the exigencies of war, the Union couldn't really afford to keep churning out ships if they thought half of them were just going to disappear the first time the wind blew up. So although you'd probably still see river Monitors, the coastal and ocean-going Monitor force that was historically built up may actually be stillborn by this incident. Galena is still Galena and therefore terrible, but when they get new Ironsides in service, and obviously that ship proved to be a fairly capable unit, that may actually then mean that, well, two interesting things. One is when New Ironsides finally shows up, it is going to overmatch the Virginia quite significantly. So the postponed First Battle of the Ironclads may well be a lot more decisive, assuming that, assuming the stars align and the Union don't send Galena in to try and take on Virginia, because in that case it'll still be a one-sided victory. It'll just be the other way around. But the general point I was trying to get at was that New Ironsides possibly being the first major ironclad to engage another ironclad and do so successfully may then prompt the Union to build more New Ironsides type broadside ocean-going ironclads as opposed to the coastal and ocean-going monitors that they did do, which ultimately that is a more capable design when you want to go more than a few miles offshore. And so you might well see a post-war American Civil War fleet that has a strong core of sail and steam mixed power plant broadside ironclads, and maybe even some casement ironclads as a follow-on. Sven Johnson asks, it seems the Japanese plan to bomb Pearl Harbor was one of playing long odds versus no other viable options to win against the USA in a war. Can you think of any strategy the Japanese could have had that would have allowed them to win, or even just basically fight to a draw against the USA and maintain some, if not all, of their empire? It seems the only real option they had was not to fight in the first place and hope to work out a diplomatic solution. Well, really, in this respect, it's a case of their only winning move is not to play, to quote a somewhat more famous saying. Realistically speaking, and Yamamoto knew this, the USA, if provoked to war, would eventually crush Japan under the heel of endless waves upon waves of warships, as they historically did. So there isn't really a strategy wherein they can fight the USA and hope in any way to win or draw. They could, in theory, achieve most of their objectives in the Asian area by not attacking the USA in the first place, bypassing the Philippines entirely and going after the other colonial possessions, which would either mean the USA doesn't join the war, or if it does, it's going to be delayed and it's going to be nowhere near the level of vitriol that was raised by the Pearl Harbor attacks. But if we're going to say that they have to fight the USA in the first place and maintain most of their empire, they'd either have to get incredibly lucky, like beyond any plausible level of luck, or they'd have to refine their entire service structure. There's no way they can win an industrial slugging match with the USA. It's just not going to happen. In terms of fighting to a draw or technical victory in that they get to keep some of the stuff that they've conquered, they're going to have to mitigate the effects of Pearl Harbor in terms of the sort of the sense of betrayal and the sneak attack factor that riled up a lot of Americans at the time. So they would have to declare war before actually attacking, which obviously then lessens their chances of success because then the US Navy is going to be told, well, by the way, we're at war, expect attack. But if by some miracle they get to declare war, and I don't know, maybe somebody's asleep at the radio or something and that message still doesn't come through, and they also somehow manage to sink everything at Pearl Harbor, plus have the carriers there and sink them, plus somehow devastate the infrastructure, etc., 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 then maybe, just maybe, they might be able to pull off a negotiated settlement with the USA, which allows them to keep some of their stuff, and probably definitely not including the Philippines. But that would not really be in terms of we acknowledge that you're superior to us and we're going to just bow out of it. That would be more a case of probably the US Navy going, we don't have anything to actually fight them with, we need some breathing room. And that peace treaty would very much just be a bit of breathing space while the USA fires up the gigantic ship printing devices that they use to manufacture the historic US Navy. It would either have to be that or massive political change in the USA, like incredibly severely isolationist politicians, or the Americans not being as willing to fight and not having courage and honor the way the Japanese actually, well, at least the Japanese propaganda, thought that they were. So yeah, very, very long odds way of maybe maintaining a draw would be to get exceptionally lucky with the Pearl Harbor attacks, destroy practically the entire US Navy strike power, and at which point you've only really bought yourself a few years of peace. Now, the Japanese might be able to fortify and build up their own forces during those years to make it a lot harder a struggle, but when the USA comes back after them, well, let's just say I wouldn't want to be in the Japanese's boots at that point. Daz Turk asks, what was the difference in numbers of ships and quality in the US Navy before World War II versus the end of World War II? Well, if you define the start of World War II as September 1939, the difference is huge. I mean, immediately prior, sort of January 1st, 1939, let's say, the US Navy has no modern battleships in service. They're still completing Washington and North Carolina. So their nastiest active fleet unit is one of the Colorados. They've got a few carriers, some decent ones, obviously with the Yorktown, Lexington, Saratoga, etc. But their aircraft and to a large extent their strategy is not particularly brilliant. Their numbers are such that the USA is the second most powerful navy in the world, arguably behind the Royal Navy at that point. And yeah, and they obviously they don't have they're just about beginning to get maybe some of the CXAM-1 radars around, so their radar and fire control systems aren't too much to write home about, and they have some very weird ideas about for night fighting and the capabilities of the enemy. Skip over to the end of World War II, and you've got some of the finest radar in the world, the best fire control systems in the world. You've got more modern battleships in service than they had really viable battleship combatants, period, prior to the start of the war. You've got carriers everywhere you look. You could probably set up an air service using a Cessna from America to Japan just by stringing carriers out across the Pacific by the time of World War II had finished. Their cruiser designs have gone from questionable to, again, superb, with things like the Baltimores, and obviously you've got the Des Moines and such like about to come into service. Destroyers have taken a massive leap. You had the inklings of some of the US destroyer designs before the war, but the mass manufacture of things like the Fletchers and the Gearings and the Sumners really comes about during the wartime period. Submarines again, you've got the Gato-Gato as basically the decent submarine of pre-war and post-war. Even that excellent design has basically already been superseded by numerous far more capable designs that have been brought in. And in terms of overall position in the world, well, the US Navy has done a very creditable job of making sure the majority of the Imperial Japanese Navy ceases to exist, and the Royal Navy, although it has also grown at a fairly spectacular rate during the Second World War, is now quite firmly in second place numerically and in certain respects qualitatively compared to the US Navy. So World War II is it's the war that turns the US Navy from one of the top naval powers to the top naval power of the world. And with all that involves, and obviously everything I just listed off, that's only a tithe of the detail of the changes. Just look at the sheer number of destroyers they built. I mean, you're talking about a navy that actually, well, forget destroyers. You're talking about a navy that built more carriers in World War II than some of its opponent navies built ships total. That gives you some idea of just how much of a difference there was. Striker 1959 says, we tend to hear more about Royal Navy light cruisers than we do the heavy variety. The only major instance I can think of off the top of my head where RN heavy cruisers were involved was the Battle of the River Plate. To me, this leaves the impression that the Royal Navy focused more on light cruisers. Is this really the case, or did the Royal Navy have more robust heavy cruiser numbers? We just don't hear so much about them. Well, having recently covered the county class, hopefully that answers some of the question. But yes, as we've mentioned in the county class and town class videos and a couple of other dry docks as well, I think, basically the Royal Navy didn't build that many heavy cruisers because, well, they built the counties and it's their various subclasses, and then they tried to build the Yorks as sort of diminutives of the counties, effectively. But they concluded, based on their own experiences, that a large light cruiser, and no, not the Glorious or Courageous, but something like a Town class with many rapid-firing 6-inch guns was just as good, if not better, against most heavy cruisers at the time, thanks to the treaty limits, and most people are emphasizing firepower over armor on their heavy cruisers, and therefore they focused more on building those. So there were a lot more Leanders and Towns around than there were counties and Yorks, and so just by sheer dint of numbers, you tended to hear more about them. And that's not to say that the heavy cruisers didn't do stuff. Obviously, as I said in the county class video last week, the heavy cruisers did get involved in a number of engagements, but more generally speaking, because of their lower numbers and obviously greater firepower, the heavy cruisers that the Royal Navy tended to be kept more for direct fleet duties, supporting the home fleet and heavy escorts and heavy escort duty, stuff like that. Whereas the more numerous and more versatile light cruisers, or both the sort of holdovers from World War One, as well as the Leanders and Towns and their various subvariants, tended to get out and about more often, sort of supporting destroyer flotillas, operating in squadrons on their own, etc., etc. And so they tended to get involved in a lot more actions, and hence we hear about them more. The Royal Navy was actually planning on sort of reviving the heavy cruiser line in the late 1930s, but unlike some navies which managed to get a few more out the door in that late period, they had the designs ready, but World War II interrupted, and Royal Navy was a little bit late off the ball on that particular mark. Edry asks, he says, it's my understanding that the Naval AA got incredibly effective when proximity fuses and radar direction came into their own. So what would have happened if we applied that across the board in 44-45? So hypothetically, the USN is fighting another navy in 44-45 with a similar tech base. Do you think the carrier would have seen a decline? I'm not sure if even US logistics could keep up with the aircraft attrition rate of repeated strikes against such an opponent, especially if this fighting is still happening in the Pacific. More in general, it would seem to me that carriers got pretty lucky with their timing. A few more years of war and it would seem they would have had a rough time of it until standoff weapons came about. Well, obviously, if you apply radar direction, good fire control, and proximity fuses across the board, then US Navy aircraft casualties are going to increase quite substantially. However, at the same time, it's not just about those, it's also about what you've got to use. So the 5-inch 38 gun is a superb anti-aircraft gun and very versatile, very good rate of fire, and well, as exhibited by the fact the US seemed to stick them on practically everything. And of course, they're also operating the 20mm Oerlikon and the 40mm Bofors, both of which are very, very good anti-aircraft guns. So when you look at the anti-aircraft guns of the enemies they might be facing, there are a few standout weapons there, but neither the Italian, German, nor Japanese navies have the kind of across-the-board multiple light, medium, and heavy caliber AA guns of the quality that the US Navy can bring to bear. So even assuming the similar tech base for fire control radar and proximity fuses, the anti-aircraft firepower isn't going to be as effective as the anti-aircraft barrage of the US Navy. And, well, there's also the fact that by 44-45, the US Navy just has so many more of those guns around. I mean, you can cover a Yamato or a Musashi with radar-guided proximity-fused guns, but when you're using the 25mm and the other Japanese AA guns, they're not going to be anywhere near as effective as the AA screen of, say, an Iowa. And even then, you wouldn't want to have an Iowa facing off against a serious air attack on its own. Part of that also you have to bear in mind is that the air attacks conducted by the Japanese were still inflicting damage. Okay, yes, some of them were kamikazes, but some of them weren't. And even with the US Navy and later on the British Pacific Fleet showing up with large numbers of aircraft, vast amounts of AA, and the aforementioned proximity fuses, radar direction, and good fire control, Japanese aircraft were still getting through. nowhere near the same numbers as they would have, but they were still getting through. And this was at a time when Japanese aircraft were not the most survivable of aircraft anyway. A lot of and their sort of relative capability compared to their counterparts had diminished. So yeah, so although yes, the casualties would have increased, the effectiveness of the U.S. Navy strikes would have obviously diminished with the increasing numbers of aircraft shot down. But based on the experiences in the Pacific, they still would have got fairly large numbers of aircraft through, um, and so they would have still been quite effective. Yes, this may have led to more surface strikes being carried out by battleships and the like, where it was in sort of historical terms, it was judged, well, let's just throw several hundred carrier aircraft at them, they can't really stop us. If the casualty rates are getting higher, they might have then just brought in cruiser and battleship squadrons and used those instead, which would have delayed the war slightly because obviously those ships can only move so fast compared to carrier aircraft. Um, but yeah, I don't. It would extend the war certainly. It wouldn't change the outcome, but it might give cruisers and battleships um, a little bit more of a longer life after the war, because as has been often said on this channel, the battleship was not obsoleted by the carrier because it was vulnerable to incoming attacks. I mean, obviously, any ship is vulnerable to incoming attacks, but a carrier is even more vulnerable than a battleship by late 44-45 to incoming enemy attacks. The reason the battleship was obsoleted by the carrier was because the carrier could hit things harder a lot further away than the battleship could. In this scenario, you're looking at a situation where actually the carrier can hit things further away, and possibly harder, but maybe not by the time casualties have gone over. And with the fact that the strike power itself is based on aircraft whose numbers will diminish with every strike, potentially the offensive power of the battleship may still remain a decisive factor. So battleships may actually remain in service, which ironically enough would probably actually mean that the Iowa class don't make it as far into the near time as they did historically, because they'd be used a lot more, which would mean they'd wear their engine plants out faster, maybe in the 60s or the 70s, at which point they might be decommissioned then. So yeah, interesting counterfactual there. Jack Ace asks, what are your thoughts on the US Navy training facilities in the landlocked state of Idaho? Besides it being well out of reach of Axis powers when it opened in 1942, why was this location chosen? Well, to be honest, any training facility in the USA is well out of reach of Axis powers in 1942. Well, unless the US had some weird ideas about putting a giant floating naval facility off the East Coast, but that aside, yeah, but the Axis isn't going to hit any of them. But why was the location chosen? Basically, it's near the West Coast. You don't want to put it in the middle of the US. The US is invested in a two-ocean war, true, but let's face it, the majority of its focus is in the Pacific. The reason you don't want to put it in a central state is because the time you would, given the sheer numbers of people you're training, you would have to ship in and out sailors from the coast where the Navy actually is, and that would mean either days on trains, which isn't very efficient, or it would mean massive airlift, which diverts aircraft from the war effort. Whereas somewhere like Idaho, with the Farragut facility that you mentioned, it's in a convenient place. It's got lots and lots of space, which actually coastal areas tend not to have, both for geographical reasons and because people tend to like living near them, and a lot of industry grows up around them. So, whereas out in the middle of Idaho, there's plenty of space to put as big a facility as you like. And to be honest, the naval training that they were doing didn't really require access to the sea. It was basic sailors training. What's left they can pick up when they're at coastal facilities or on ships. And as I say, in terms of distance, it's not unreasonably far by train from the coast, so they can get to and from the actual Navy in relatively good time. And in a lot of ways, it also makes things easier to supply because obviously when you're talking about tens of thousands of people, you've got to feed and water them all. So again, high density areas where infrastructure may be at a strain, not such a good idea. Somewhere slightly further inland where you can it also shortens your supply routes to and from places that are providing you with food, water, and other liquids. Um, Always a good idea. So yeah, I think that's basically why they chose it. It's always a good place to put large naval training facilities. Basically, somewhere where you don't have to worry about land constraints. So Long John asks if Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had actually attempted to fight HMS Malaya and or HMS Ramilles during Operation Berlin, how would they have fared against each? Well, Malaya is definitely the more dangerous of the two opponents. It's Queen Elizabeth as opposed to a Revenge class. The speed difference is not quite as bad, and also it's been more modernized more recently, so therefore is likely to have better fire control, etc., etc. Um, but of course, they broke away because they had orders not to engage enemy capital ships. Now, in terms of an actual engagement, it's a difficult one to call because the two German ships, bear in mind they'd be fighting each of these singly. That's not the Malaya and Ramillies were escorting separate convoys, so it's not like a 2v2. Um, Malaya, the British ships have the advantage of they need to protect the convoy. They don't need to go chasing after the German ships. So the German speed advantage is not entirely negated, but it is to a degree because they've got to come after the British ships, not the other way around. The 15-inch gun is capable of dealing some serious damage to the German ships, as we saw previously in the war when they'd actually gone up against the Renown in a storm. And Renown had gone, actually no, I'll take you on these odds. And now they're facing ships that have more armor, two more guns. Then their only downside being that they are slower. The 11-inch guns on Scharnhorst and Gneisenau will have problems dealing with the main armour protection of Malaya and Ramillies at close range, although being relatively unmodernised in Ramillies' case and not fully modernised in Malaya's case, at long range deck penetration is a possibility, but then hitting is potentially not so much of a possibility, albeit HMS Glorious engagement does suggest it is certainly not off the cards. As I, it's basically you're looking at fewer larger guns capable of doing more damage at longer range versus more numerous lighter guns that have to close in to do significant damage, but could always overwhelm with rate of fire. Because as we've mentioned in other videos before, the simple fact is that if you can hit your enemy ship enough times, you're going to break something vital sooner or later, even if you never penetrate the armor, like say fire control systems or the bridge. So it could go either way. Statistically, in terms of just pelting shells at each other, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau have the upper hand in that they're more likely to score something. They're going to sort of cripple the British ship's ability to fight back sooner or later. The question is whether or not during that sooner or later period the 15-inch guns find their own targets, at which point things go very badly. And one of the reasons they didn't engage in the first place was because even if they had a chance of winning, the fact was that if they took the kind of damage they probably would take in so doing, one or both of them might not make it back to Germany, which would have been a little bit of egg on the face really there, considering they represented a far greater percentage of Germany's capital ships than either Malaya or Ramillies represented of Britain's capital ships. So yeah, I wouldn't like to call it either way, to be honest, because it's gonna come down basically to luck of the draw. If Malaya and or Ramillies can't find the range quickly enough, then there's a very good chance that the Germans can overwhelm them, cripple their combat ability, and then move in to finish them off. But equally, at the same time, once those 15-inch guns start finding the range, the Germans are overmatched in firepower terms and would probably break off, because ultimately, as long as Malaya and or Ramilles can remain afloat, there are other British ships in the Atlantic that can come to help them, whereas, as we sort of intimated earlier, if either of the German ships take significant damage, well, there aren't any other German ships in the area to help them, and there are a lot of British ships that will quite happily come in and finish them off. So yeah, maybe that's a scenario I should play out as an Atlantic Fleet or war game. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, is there any particular reason that the Japanese did not commit Yamato and perhaps Musashi to running the slot in the Guadalcanal campaign? Had they done so, what would the result have been had they, or even one of them, been substituted for Hiei or Kirishima? I assume it would not have gone well for Washington and South Dakota, but with their slower speed, would they have been able to survive the air attacks the next morning, and how effective would they have been at bombarding Henderson Field? The reason they didn't commit their battleships is the same reason that, well, Kirishima wasn't expecting to find South Dakota or Washington. The Japanese believed that the slot and the area in the Guadalcanal that all this took place in was not suitable for battleships, and they didn't think that the US Navy would deploy battleships in the area. And so when they were willing to risk some of the Congo class, they thought they would run into heavy cruisers at best, which obviously the Congos in theory would be quite capable of dealing with. So yeah, that's why they didn't send them in, because, well, if you don't think the US can deploy a 35 or 40,000 ton battleship into an area, you definitely aren't going to think you can deploy a 65 to 70,000 ton battleship into that area safely. In terms of their speed, they're only a little bit slower. I mean, they're still sort of 27 knotters. They would obviously be subject to air attacks, etc. But the overall distance they cover, it's not going to make tremendous odds compared to the Congos. So I don't think their speed is necessarily so much of an issue, albeit they obviously will make themselves slightly more vulnerable. Bombarding Henderson Field, well, 18.1-inch guns. 18.1-inch high explosive rounds, that's going to do a lot of damage. And of course, at this point in the war, they've still got their significant numbers of their 6.6-inch batteries as well. So they would do quite a number on Henderson Field, I would imagine. What would have been the result if they'd been substituted for Hiei or Kirishima? Well, yeah, a close range knife fight with Yamato. If we just substitute Yamato for Kirishima and assume that everything else goes the same, and South Dakota suddenly finds itself wandering into the path of the Yamato, it's not going to go well. South Dakota took a bit of a mauling but survived because Kirishima was unable to really penetrate its armor even at relatively close ranges. That is not the case for Yamato's guns. Yamato's guns will quite happily punch through South Dakota's protection at that kind of range. So yeah, that's not going to go well for them. In terms of Washington, well, it depends on whether or not Yamato has its own radar on how good its spotters are. And Yamato is still going to get plastered by various cruisers and destroyers in the area as well, which didn't help Kirishima's case that much. Assuming that Washington can get round and launch the same kind of surprise attack it did on Kirishima, then actually, believe it or not, even though it's the older ship, Washington has a fairly good chance of putting down the Yamato, because again, it's effectively the whole thing is a close range knife fight by battleship standards, and as well protected as the Yamato is, its armor probably isn't going to stand it in all that much good stead against Washington's guns at that kind of point blank range, or near enough. So I mean, yeah, it'll last longer and better than Kirishima, but a Pinata might have lasted longer and better than Kirishima. So yeah, South Dakota's almost certainly going down. Washington may get a kill in. It may be an outright victory. It may be a mutual kill. Yamato's spotters might be better than Kirishima's and spot it coming, or it might just shrug off the first few salvos and turn around and blast the Washington as well, because, well, Washington's in an even worse situation than South Dakota when it comes to protection against a close-range firefight with a Yamato. But I don't think at that point, if we do have that engagement, I don't think that Yamato is going to survive to get home, because even if it does manage to take down both South Dakota and Washington, which is not out of the realms of reality given the situation as it unfolded with Kirishima, you may still, well, you will be looking at a ship that is quite badly damaged, and if the American cruisers and destroyers don't set it on fire and or torpedo it during the night, it's certainly going to be limping home in the morning, at which point, especially if two of their most modern battleships have gone down, the US Navy is going to be out for blood. So imagine kind of the Royal Navy's reaction when Hood went up going after the Bismarck, only with lots and lots and lots of aircraft instead. So yeah, I think that's probably how that would go down. But again, this could be a very interesting scenario to try and war game out. Unfortunately, so that I don't know if there's any digital games which could realistically model that. But oh well. And look at that, we have actually finally broken the hour mark in the dry dock. Hooray! Somebody wave a flag and pop a bottle of champagne or something. Anyway, the last question goes to Brad, and he says, when did the Royal Navy go from fighting against the odds battles, such as those portrayed in the Revenge special, to being the big bad of the seas? Well, they never really gave up on the against the odds battles, because once they became larger, they sort of spread out across the world, which meant that localized superiority by various individual enemy forces was still possible, and there were still quite a number of interesting either last stands or significantly against the odds battles that the Royal Navy would fight all through the Napoleonic era, and obviously in the First and Second World Wars as well. But in terms of shifting over from, sort of, I get the general drift of your question of shifting over from the Royal Navy going, enemies, well, let's run away, and maybe one of us, one or two of us who get caught are going to have to do some kind of heroic thing and probably die horribly, to being, we're the Royal Navy, everyone else should run away from us. That fulcrum point is probably somewhere around the later Napoleonic War era. Because you've got the Revenge, then you've got the sort of charting roughly the course of major Royal Navy wars. You've got the three Anglo-Dutch wars, where the Royal Navy and the Dutch Navy struggle for ascendancy over each other consistently, and there's no real clear-cut winner when taken as a whole, although the Dutch militarily definitely come out ahead in the Second and Third Dutch Wars, albeit their economy is another matter. You've then got the various wars with royalist France and wars with Spain on and off happening throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. And again, it kind of seesaws back and forth a bit. The Royal Navy tends to get the better of the French and the Spanish, so they have a slight ascendancy. But then you have things like the Battle of Chesapeake Bay, where not so much. So the Royal Navy has a slight edge, but it's an edge that they have to fight very hard to keep. Then you get into the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon does the wonderful job of taking a lot of the experienced and veteran French naval officers who just happen to be aristocrats and either driving them out of the country or killing them, which dramatically decreases the effective fighting power of the French Navy, much to the Royal Navy's relief. And then you have things like Trafalgar, Battle of the Nile, Battle of Copenhagen, etc., all of which are Nelson's victories, as well as others, where the Royal Navy gradually gets an ascendancy over the French and Spanish navies, and then holds on to it like a dog with a bone for a very long period of time. So obviously you have the War of 1812, which starts off as kind of like the Royal Navy's second string B team versus the US Navy, and then escalates as the pressure on the Royal Navy from the Napoleonic Wars lessens, and they start sending in some of their actually good ships. So yeah, it's probably around about 18. If you want to get from a point where the Royal Navy is consistently fighting against the odds actions, to being the one with the overwhelming superiority of firepower and numbers, you're probably looking around the 1810s. Because remember, even Trafalgar, as dramatic a victory as it is by the Royal Navy, is still fought from a position of having significant odds against them in terms of numbers and guns. Nelson's force is smaller and on paper inferior to the Spanish and French combined fleet. So yeah, about 1810s into the 1820s, that's when the Royal Navy goes from expecting to fight against the odds to expecting to be the dominant and larger navy in almost any engagement they fight. And that wraps up this episode of the Patreon Drydock, and it also signifies, as we said earlier, the first time we've actually breached that 1 hour mark. So if you skipped over the channel admin bits at the beginning, you might want to take a look at those ones. There's a few things you can comment on and make influence decisions on, a couple of important bits and pieces of information in there. And thank you very much for watching, if, as to quote another YouTuber, if indeed you still are, and I hope to see you again in the next video.